Winter of 1992 and 1993, Al-Qaeda's training camp complex at Jihad Wall was bustling with activity. The tin sheds that had served as housing were replaced with concrete buildings. The mosque was expanded. A new residential house was built for Osama bin Laden. We changed the whole map of the area, recalled Fadil Haroun, who was taking part in the construction work. His account is a stark contradiction to most existing narratives of Al-Qaeda, which claimed that Al-Qaeda abandoned Afghanistan and relocated to Sudan in this period. If this is true, why would Al-Qaeda spend time fortifying and improving Jihad Wall? Although the details of Haroun's account cannot be independently confirmed, it is fairly certain that Al-Qaeda planned to continue having a presence in Afghanistan after the war against Soviet occupation and the Afghan communist regime was over. Eyewitnesses confirm that Al-Qaeda continued to run training courses in the Jihad Wall complex in late 1992 and early 1993. When the Afghan Mujahideen took over Kabul in April of 1992, Khost had already developed into a sprawling training ground for foreign jihadists. Pakistani jihadists had moved into the province and were training for Kashmir. Arabs were training for classical jihad or for revolution in their home countries. There seemed to be no reason why Al-Qaeda should leave just yet. Instead, Al-Qaeda redefined its mission in Afghanistan from frontline fighting to training. Bin Laden's decision to withdraw from frontline fighting in Afghanistan was in line with the majority view of the Afghan Arabs at the time. The Afghan civil war was viewed as fitna, which means civil strife, in which it was illegitimate for Arabs to participate. Most independent commanders at the time either left the area or started running training camps for their own purposes. Ibn Khattab, the Saudi commander who had fought in Nangarhar, opened up a front in Tajikistan. Azmari, who had led a group in Nangarhar, went to Southeast Asia to work with Islamist groups there. A Jordanian commander named Abu Harith al-Urdini, who had fought with Jalaluddin Haqqani in Khost, left fighting altogether and settled in Khost. Others went to Bosnia to fight with the Bosnian Muslims against the Serbs, or started preparing for revolution in their home countries. The goal of the Afghan Arabs was discordant, yet the majority agreed that the Afghan civil war should be avoided. The civil war is too complex to be treated in any detail here. Suffice to say that for the Islamists in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the most contentious issue was the conflict between the Pashtun Gulbuddin Hekmatyar on one hand and the Tajik Burhanuddin Rabbani and his commander Ahmed Shah Massoud on the other. After Mujahideen conquered Kabul in April of 1992, Hekmatyar started battling Massoud's forces for control over the city. Massoud's forces occupied central positions in Kabul, while Hekmatyar was left on the southern outskirts of the city in an area called Chahar Asyab. From here, he infamously started bombarding Kabul with rockets, a devastating affair that by 1996 had left most of southern Kabul in ruins. There was one notable exception to the general attitude among the Afghan Arabs to avoid the civil war. A fringe group of some 50 fighters fought with Hekmatyar during the war. The most prominent commander among them was a Syrian named Abu Rawada al-Suri, who formed the Yarmouk battalion to fight with Hekmatyar, and a young Palestinian commander named Abu Muzaz al-Kosti. Both of them had fought on Haqqani's front line in Ghost and Gardez prior to the fall of Kabul. Abu Rawada had previously fought alongside Massoud's forces in northern Afghanistan. However, toward the end of the 1980s, Abu Rawada became part of an anti-Massoud contest in Peshawar. The current formed after allegations started to circulate among Arabs that Massoud's fighters were killing other Mujahideen and that Massoud himself was an agent of foreign powers. Hekmatyar's party contributed to exaggerating the rumors. Building on the anti-Massoud sentiment that had been simmering since the 1980s, Hekmatyar framed his participation in the civil war after 1992 as a continuation of the jihad and saw himself as the only Mujahideen leader who was truly interested in establishing an Islamic State. The war had a deep divisionary effect on the Islamist current in Pakistan. Two broad ideological camps emerged, which we may term the Deobandi camp and the Ikhwani camps. The Deobandis did not support one particular party, but saw reconciliation between the Mujahideen leaders as the only viable solution to end the war. Proponents of this view included scholars and students from the prominent Deobandi institutions in Karachi and at Akhora, Cuttack. In Afghanistan, supporters of the Deobandi view included Sheikh Yunus Khalis and his commander, Jalaluddin Haqqani. They both had their education from Dar-ul-Alam Haqqani at Hadhor, Cuttack, and they were both conspicuously absent from the war. The other principal stance taken by some Islamists in Pakistan is what we may call the Ikhwani camp. The word Ikhwanis, in this context, refers to ideological adherents of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, also known as Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, which originated in Egypt in the late 1920s. The Ikhwans viewed Gulbuddin Hekmatyar as the only Afghan leader who sincerely wanted an Islamic revolution in Afghanistan, and they viewed his main adversaries, Burhanuddin Rabbani and Ahmad Shah Massoud, as hypocrites. A main proponent of this view was Kazani Hussain Ahmad, leader of the Pakistani Islamist political party, the Jamaat-e-Islami. Among the Afghans, the only proponent of the Ikhwan view was Hekmatyar himself, who was generally regarded as a spoiler by the other Mujahideen parties. Hekmatyar also had support of the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, who did not support Hekmatyar for ideological reasons like the Ikhwans, who were treated but Afghan politics as an extension of their own national security agenda. The ISI saw Hekmatyar at the time as the best bulwark against Indian and other foreign influences in Pakistan's backyard. Al-Qaeda's relationship with Hekmatyar needs mention because the relationship is treated only superficially in existing literature. After 1989, Al-Qaeda established a close cooperative relationship with Hekmatyar's Hizb-e-Islami that appears to have been more elaborate than with the other Mujahideen parties. In this period, Al-Qaeda built a training camp infrastructure in the Jihad Wal area and rented land from Hekmatyar for this purpose. In 1991, Al-Qaeda's basic course recruits were taught heavy weaponry in a Hekmatyar-run training camp, which the Arabs referred to as Al-Jabal, also known as the mountain. Moreover, the Bin Laden affiliate charity, the Benevolence International Foundation, BIF, gave direct military support to Hekmatyar's fighters, including uniforms and blankets, rockets, and other ammunition. However, after the Mujahideen's conquest of Kabul in April 1992, Al-Qaeda stopped supporting Hekmatyar on an operational level. Al-Qaeda at this time withdrew all their frontline units and weapons to Jihad Wal to concentrate on training. For this purpose, Al-Qaeda continued to rent land from Hekmatyar's commander, Fayez Muhammad, but this appears to have been more of a morality. Bin Laden's decision to abandon his old comrade-in-arms at Shahar Asyab is but one example of a situation in which Al-Qaeda let a theological principle, the duty to avoid fitna, guide their strategic decisions to withdraw from the front lines and concentrate on training. Bin Laden's decision to avoid the Afghan civil war places him ideologically within the Deobandi camp, who favored neutrality on reconciliation between Hekmatyar and Rabbani. It is possible that Bin Laden was involved in reconciliation talks between the two leaders, but probably not in any decisive capacity. In any case, Al-Qaeda's main activity from now on was to train their own cadre who had taken part in jihad elsewhere, and to support other groups and individuals who did the same. Al-Qaeda's decision corresponded well with the wishes of the Afghan proponents of the Deobandi current, Yunus Khalis and Jalaluddin Haqqani. Khalis said about the Arabs in 1992, quote, "I want them to restrain themselves from forming a separate group, and they must be neutral in the discussions between the jihadi parties," end quote. Haqqani's sentiments were similar. In an interview published in August 1992, Jalaluddin Haqqani put forward 3 demands to the Arabs who stayed in Afghanistan. 1. That they do not abandon military training. 2. That they do not allow corrupt elements to enter their organization who will instigate factionalism among them and create problems between them and the Afghans. 3. That they do not form parties or groups to compete with the Afghan parties and become involved in their own problems, or that they enter internal struggles that would make it hard for them to remain in the country. They should be a peace negotiator between parties who are quarreling, he concluded. Haqqani at the time did not participate in the Afghan civil war, but acted as a national-level peace negotiator among the various Mujahideen factions. Haqqani's demand that Arabs should not abandon military training likely refers to the training activities taking place in Khost at that time, designed to support jihadist fighting in Kashmir and elsewhere. Haqqani was an outspoken supporter of such activity. From the end of the 1980s, he had also started expressing anti-American sentiment and support for both classical and revolutionary jihadism. However, this does not mean that his ideas somehow served as inspiration for bin Laden's global jihadi ideology as it evolved in the 1990s. Anti-American and pro-jihadist ideals were both widespread among Islamists in Afghanistan and Pakistan at this time. The failure of the Afghan Mujahideen to create an Islamic State in Afghanistan was hard to swallow for those who had put their hopes on the Mujahideen, so conspiracy theories about the involvement of foreign hands naturally started to flourish. The Americans, who were widely seen as having abandoned Afghanistan once the Soviets left, were a convenient scapegoat. Pro-jihadist ideas were also widespread, one of the reasons being the conflict in Kashmir, which was widely regarded as Indian occupation of Muslim territory. However, the conflict in Palestine and Saddam's invasion of Kuwait were also topics of interest to Afghan Mujahideen at this time. As a curiosity, in a speech in Mecca on September 10, 1990, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar proposed to send Afghan Mujahideen to Saudi Arabia to protect the country's 2 holy sanctuaries, to replace the foreign army, as he said. It was around the same time that Osama bin Laden went to the Saudi defense minister with a similar proposal. Anyway, the gist of Haqqani's message was that Arabs should stay out of the civil war and not act as spoilers. As long as they followed these rules, they were welcome to use Afghanistan to train for classical jihad in occupied Muslim lands such as Kashmir or Bosnia, or revolutionary jihad in the Middle East. When the Taliban came to power in 1995-1996, the attitude was much the same. Here lies some of the key to understanding the Al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship. The Deobandi camp, of which both Haqqani and later the Taliban were a part, saw various training projects of the Arabs as a commendable activity that involved risking one's own life for the defense of Islam. The activities were not at the time associated with terrorism. Against this backdrop, Al-Qaeda continued with 3 types of training activities in Khost. First, they continued to offer basic and specialized training courses in Al-Faruq and the auxiliary camp Al-Sadiq. These courses were sometimes open to non-Al-Qaeda members. This is evident because Abu Zubaydah, a Palestinian jihadist who we shall meet later in this chapter, trained at Al-Sadiq in December 1992. At the time, he was contemplating whether to go to Bosnia to fight, a common motivation among Arabs in Peshawar at the time. Abu Zubaydah noted in his diary in late 1992 that he went to Khost for training with al-Qaeda in the camps run by bin Laden. This is a curious detail. It is perhaps the earliest example of a non-al-Qaeda member using the name al-Qaeda to refer to bin Laden's organization. It shows that the name al-Qaeda was in use among the Afghan Arabs long before 2001. It was not a name invented by the FBI, as suggested by some al-Qaeda historians. In addition to offering basic and specialized training courses in Khost, al-Qaeda allowed other jihadist groups to use their camp complex for training. Al-Qaeda supported these groups with logistics and sometimes trainers. In late 1992, al-Qaeda offered assistance to Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri's Egyptian Islamic Jihad, whose goals and philosophy at the time were different from al-Qaeda's. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad's goal at the time was to fight the Egyptian regime, whereas al-Qaeda did not want to limit the struggle to one specific territory. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad and al-Qaeda later merged into one organization, but this did not happen until years later, in 2001. At that point, al-Zawahiri had abandoned the strategy of a staging revolution in Egypt and endorsed bin Laden's global agenda. Fadil Haroun, who worked as a secretary in Jihad Wall at the time, wrote that in late 1992, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad was using a section of Jihad Wall called Khalid bin Walid to train their members. An al-Qaeda trainer gave them a course on arming and disarming mines, and an Egyptian nicknamed Haidara gave training in close protection. Al-Qaeda later hired Haidara to teach a course in close protection for al-Qaeda's own members. Haidara, as it turns out, is the infamous Ali Muhammad, the naturalized U.S. citizen and former instructor at the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. His presence in Khost at the time was most opportune for al-Qaeda, which was in a period of expansion and in need of skilled trainers to raise the competence of their own members. This brings us to the third type of training activity run by al-Qaeda in Khost, their internal courses or cadre courses. These were advanced training courses for al-Qaeda's members only. The purpose was to create a pool of qualified personnel that in the future would be able to fill various positions in the organization. Fadil Haroun attended such a course in late 1992 or early 1993. The contents of the course indicate that al-Qaeda was still very much an organization focused on guerrilla warfare. The recruits trained on guerrilla tactics and regular warfare and learned how to organize battles, covering everything from a squadron up to a brigade. But there was also a section on how to form cells in cities, teaching a variety of skills associated with urban terrorism, and a special course on pistols, which taught skills associated with assassination. In another course held by Ali Muhammad in Hayatbad in early 1993, a group of al-Qaeda and Egyptian Islamic Jihad members were taught urban reconnaissance techniques. As part of the course, the trainees were given practical tasks like drawing a sketch of the Iranian consulate in Peshawar and stalking an Egyptian embassy employee throughout the city. By now, it seems clear that al-Qaeda's cadre were learning skills relevant for staging terrorist attacks and assassinations, as opposed to previously when their training focused solely on guerrilla warfare. However, at the time, it did not signify a strategic shift. Although al-Qaeda affiliated militants staged attacks on American targets in Yemen as early as 1992, I argue that al-Qaeda did not make the strategic shift to international terrorism until August 1996, when bin Laden declared jihad on U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia. Up until then, al-Qaeda's military activities centered on guerrilla warfare and cadre education. Fadil Harun claims that al-Qaeda's military committee was divided into two in 1992. The East Africa section, which was tasked with training Islamist guerrillas in Somalia, and the Afghanistan section, which would continue to oversee al-Qaeda's training activity in Jihad Wal. The leader of the military committee, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, went to Kenya to establish a new headquarters there. His deputy, Abu Hafs, remained in Peshawar to the point of contact for the Afghanistan section. However, by mid or late 1993, Abu Hafs left Peshawar and moved to East Africa as well. The reasons for his move are unclear, but it was likely related to Pakistani police crackdowns on Arabs residing in Peshawar, which are discussed later in this chapter. Abu Hafs left for Somalia to visit the al-Qaeda training project there and settled eventually with bin Laden in Khartoum. After Abu Hafs left Peshawar, the Afghanistan section of al-Qaeda's military committee dwindled in importance. From now on, al-Qaeda's presence at Jihad Wal was reduced to a group of between 5 and 10 people, led by a U.S. citizen of Tunisian origin, Abu Atta al-Sharqi. Abu Atta was known as a skilled weapons engineer, but was not among the high-ranking members of the military committee. They had all but left for East Africa by this time. The Arabs who remained were given the rather dull task of overseeing al-Qaeda's possessions in the area until the al-Qaeda leadership decided whether to close down completely. But thanks to a few enterprising individuals, a new mission was created, the Tajikistan Project. It ensured that al-Qaeda stayed in Afghanistan throughout the Civil War, if only but a handful of members that were largely left to fend for themselves.